Finish chapter 1, which is overview. A little bit of a complete overview for the entire course, this course and the subsequent course to follow in the spring. All right. We're going to went through biological hierarchy, different levels of organization. We're going to start at the very beginning. Okay? Very beginning being simplest form, atoms. All right? Why do we have to do this background chemistry in biology? Any ideas? Who cares about chemistry? We're taking chemistry. We don't need chemistry in this class too. Thoughts? Just because Dr. Valcruz says so?
All the science happening at once.
All right, so they're all interrelated. Sciences happen together, excuse me. Biology by itself is an interdisciplinary science. Okay? And what happens in a biological system depends upon what happens in an interaction between chemicals and molecules and atoms. All right? And living things are subject to the laws of physics and chemistry. Right? Your tibia can only take so much pressure, body weight, etc., before it breaks. All right? Those of you who are in physical therapy, you'll take physics for that, and you figure out levers and etc. When you have to take that physics course. Okay? At the beginning, well, that sounded godly. Instead of at the beginning, let's use all things. Okay? All things are composed of matter. All right? And matter is anything that takes up space and has mass. Or on Earth, we interchange mass and weight as equals. All right? What do you know about matter? It's everything. It's everything. Okay? And? Matter can be broken down up to a certain point. Right? It's made up of elements. And those elements consist of atoms. All right, so we have atoms and elements, and matter can't be broken down. It can be up to a certain point. Up to you get to matter can be broken down from water bottle to plastics to water. Eventually water gets broken down into hydrogen and oxygen, right? Can you break down hydrogen and oxygen anymore? Technically, yes, into their atoms, but then can you break down the atoms of hydrogen and oxygen anymore? You could. You could break them down, but what happens when you break them down beyond an element? They lose their properties. So that's the defining characteristic of an element. It's the smallest unit that you can break matter down to and still retain the properties of that substance. Okay? So you have hydrogen gas. That's floating everywhere. There's millions and millions and millions of atoms, right, within the hydrogen gas. You break it down into hydrogen atoms. Could you break the atom down to protons and neutrons and electrons? Yes, we have that technology. Okay? But when you do that, you no longer have the properties of hydrogen. All right? So, elements. Elements consist of atoms, and those atoms interact to form compounds. A compound is a substance consisting of two or more elements in a fixed ratio. Start throwing out examples of compounds. CO2, H2O, NaCl. Any more? Someone said CO2 is carbon dioxide, same thing. sulfur dioxide, H2SO4, C6H12O6, glucose, fructose, sucrose, you name it, right? Those are all compounds, right? They consist of two or more elements or atoms of elements interacting with one another. That now that interaction, usually that compound, because of the interaction of those atoms, usually has different properties from the two atoms separately. Use hydrogen and oxygen as an example. Hydrogen gas, oxygen gas at room temperature in the elemental form. They come together, they interact. What do they form? Water, which is liquid at room temperature, right? Has a whole different set of properties as a compound that is aside from what its elements, elemental constituents have on their own. Okay? What is that an example of? What property of biology is that an example of? Or let me say, not say property, but theme of biology that is an example of. The theme of emerging properties. All right? Properties emerge as interactions occur. All right? In the human body, about 96% of mass, that is you, is made up of four elements. Carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. All right? In different ratios, depending upon which compound we're talking about. In different forms, depending upon which compound we're talking about, etc. The rest is made up of these other elements: calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium. All right? And then you have trace elements: molybdenum, iron, iodine, silicon, selenium, etc. that are necessary for necessary for normal life processes, but they are not in very high abundance. Okay? So, how does the structure of an element and its atoms define its properties? And how do that structure also define its interactions? All right. Again, so we've talked about emergent properties already, and now we're going to go over the importance of structure and function. All right. You should be familiar with the structure of atoms. Yes? Okay. What is the structure, in your own words? Tell me the structure of an atom.
It's comprised of a nucleus that's made up of neutrons and protons. And then that's where most of the weight or mass is.
Mm-hmm.
And then for however many protons there are, there's also usually, unless it's an isotope, there's an amount of electrons.
Okay.
And they're floating around, they're orbiting around the nucleus.
Okay. So we have a nucleus, central portion of an atom composed of a certain number of protons, a certain number of neutrons, and around that nucleus are electrons. Okay? The protons have a positive charge. The electrons have a negative charge. Neutrons have no charge. So in the elemental form, normally the number of protons is equal to the number of electrons, which means there's usually a net charge of what? 0. Okay, because neutrons are neutral, they're not charged. Okay. There are other subatomic particles, neutrinos, bosons, etc., that for this purpose we are not concerned about. Okay. Okay? That's elemental physics beyond my realm of expertise. All right, so we said that those electrons orbit the nucleus and they float around in their sort of area. Correct? All right, so here's your nucleus with an electron cloud in A and a shell diagram in B. All right, we'll use the shell diagram more often. Here are your electrons, right? And your neutrons are positive. I'm sorry, protons are positive, neutrons are not charged. Right? Okay. Electrons have their own distinct area that they occupy. Okay? So we're getting to this point where we talked about, we just looked at shells. All right? We have a number of protons is equal to the number of electrons. And up to now, we've just looked at two protons, 2 electrons. They fill that shell. Okay? Each of those orbits of where those electrons occupy, right, there's a certain number of electrons that can occupy that area. All right? So for the first shell, and once that area is occupied, the electrons have to be moved somewhere else. Right? For the first shell, for that first area, 2 electrons are all that can populate that first shell before moving on to the next shell. Okay? So 2 electrons, full. That is a stable element because the outer shell, the most outer shell, if it just has 2 electrons, is full. Okay? Example being, what is that called? Helium, He, atomic number 2, which means what? Atomic number means what? Number of protons, and is also equal to the number of electrons. All right, so we're going to draw this guy out. Let's say 2 protons, 2 neutrons in the nucleus, right? And then we have the outer shell, which has 1 electron. I'll just put a little minus on it. Right? That its outermost shell, which happens to be its first shell, is also full, and therefore helium is stable. Stable or inert, meaning it doesn't inert means it doesn't normally react with anything. Okay? But now we have lithium. All right, lithium atomic number 3, which means we have, I won't draw there's our nucleus. We have 1 shell with 2 electrons, and then what? Alyssa? Another shell with 1 electron. I'm not very good at drawing little blobs. Okay? That 1 electron on the outside, that outer shell, does that make lithium happy? No. Why? What's the goal of all atoms? Kate? What's the goal of all atoms? To be stable. Okay? And how does an atom become stable? To have its outermost shell full, right? Or, let's say, at a point where it recognizes that it's happy to be full, okay? Because the first shell fills with 2, happy. The next shell fills with 8. The third shell can actually carry up to 18. All right, but the third shell is also happy if it just has 8. Okay, that's what we call the octet rule. After the first shell, the subsequent shells, 2 through whatever, are happy and stable when 8 electrons are occupying that outer shell. Okay? Questions on electron shells? The outermost shell is also known as what? Valence shell.
Sorry, so you said that you could have up to 18 electrons in
In the third shell, you can have, that shell is large enough to carry up to 18. But it is also satisfied with having 8 occupied.
Why 18 and not 16 if it's the second shell can hold up to 8? Then it could just 8 and 8.
Well, no. So you have the first shell's 2.
Right.
The second shell can have 8.
8 and
The
then
third shell by itself has a carrying capacity of 18. But if it has 8 electrons, it's happy. Okay?
So it's considered stable if the third shell has 8.
Yes. All right, and this has to do with properties of the orbitals, of how they rotate around the nucleus in what we call these 3 2p orbitals and the orbital shells. Okay?
Like, what happens when, like, if they're happy? Like, what happens if they're mad and it's not?
What happens if they're not full?
Yeah.
What's their goal? To be full or to have a full, complete outer shell? That's where the interactions come in. So if lithium, for instance, has 1 electron on its outer shell, what is its closest stable state? Now that second shell would be stable and occupied when there's 8 full. All right? So lithium having 1 would have to do what? Have to gain 7 or lose that 1 and come down to the next lower shell where that 2 electrons are filling that shell. Okay? So that's where the properties of the structure here lead to what it does in turn in trying to become stable. Okay? And that's a perfect segue into chemical bonding. All right, any more questions on shells? The octet rule, the goal is to have a stable outer or valence shell, and however it does that is an interaction between 2 elements. Okay? So atoms with incomplete valence shells, they can share or transfer electrons. All right? With other atoms. So meaning they share, the 2 elements share 1 electron which fills both shells or occupies both shells, or transfer, gain, or lose an electron. We'll go back to the example of lithium. That 1 outer electron usually is given up pretty easily, okay? Because it has its more stable shell in the first shell. All right? These interactions result in atoms staying close together, held by ends up the property of chemical bonding. 2 or more atoms interacting with one another in order to develop a stable molecule, a stable compound. All right? 2 types of chemical bonds. We have covalent bonds, which are sharing of electrons, and then ionic bonds, where electrons move from one element to another. So lithium, giving up its outer electron, is likely to form which of these 2 bonds? It is typically in an ionic bond. Okay? So an electron is exchanged. Now, when lithium gives up its electron, what occurs? What goes with it? Giving up the electron, electrons are what? They're negative charged. So that electron goes, that negative charge goes with the electron. Now what's the net charge of that lithium? It's a +1, right? Because it still has those 3 protons, but only has 2 electrons, therefore a positive charge. All right, examples of hydrogen bonding. You have, covalent bonds, hydrogen gas, oxygen gas, water, methane, right, are all examples of shared electrons between two different elements to form a stable compound. Now, not in all cases, is sharing electrons an equal relationship. Okay? In some cases, there are greedy atoms. All right? In some cases, atoms hold on to the electrons more than the other atom. Okay? And that's based upon their properties. All right? So electronegativity is an atom's attraction for the electrons in a covalent bond. If two atoms, right, are equally electronegative, they share the electrons the same way, the same amount of time. Okay? Example, oxygen gas, oxygen and oxygen. Obviously, they're the same atoms, so they're going to have the same electronegativity. The electrons will share equal time between the two atoms. Okay? Depending upon the amount of electronegativity, however, when they're not equal, the more electronegative an atom is, the longer it will hold on to the electron. Okay? So the more electronegative an atom, the more strongly it pulls the shared electrons towards itself, which ends up being an unequal visitation rights, right? An unequal amount of time that the electron is sharing with one atom over another. Okay? This ends up being what we call a polar covalent bond. All right? When they're shared equally, it's a non-polar covalent bond. All right? What does that look like? So, we're going to use hydrogen in this case. Or we're going to use water. Right? Here's oxygen and hydrogen. Okay? Now, in water, okay, hydrogen's electrons here, and then you have oxygen's electrons 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's outer shell. Okay? So oxygen, atomic number 8, has 6 electrons in its outer shell. Okay? Which they will share in this covalent bond. Now, oxygen is probably one of the highest electronegative compounds, all right, or atoms. So it tends to hold and pull on those electrons more than the hydrogen. Okay, so the orbit of this electron is pulled closer to hydrogen for closer to oxygen for a longer period of time. So the flight of the electrons ends up being lots of time in that shell, a little bit here. Lots of time over here, a little bit here. Okay? That is a polar covalent bond. Why is it polar? What makes it polar? Anyone?
One end is slightly negative.
Why? Or one end is slightly negative and one end is slightly positive. Why?
Because the electrons aren't shared equally,
Because the electrons are not shared equally, spending more time on the oxygen, right, also means the electrons over there, which means there's a slight negative charge, right, which then means there's a slight positive charge at each one of those hydrogens. Okay, so a polar covalent bond, unequal sharing, and it also gives a positive and a negative end of the bond itself. Okay? Now, we're using water as an example. Water is a polar molecule. The fact that it has this polar covalent bond gives it its polarity, a slight positive end, a slight negative end. There's water. All right, there's your slight positive charge, a slight negative charge, okay, because of the unequal sharing of electrons, which is directly related to oxygen's high electronegativity. Questions on polar versus nonpolar covalent bonds? Ionic bonds, okay, are much more straightforward. Okay, anytime there is a gain or transfer, a gain, loss, or transfer of electrons, there is an ionic bond that's formed. In this case, you have sodium, atomic number 11. So 2 electrons in its first shell, 8 in the second shell, 1 lonely electron in that big third shell. Okay? What is its easiest path to get to a stable state? To give up that electron. Okay? On the flip side, you have chlorine, atomic number 17. 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 in the second, and then 7 electrons that almost feel like a full group in that outer shell. What is its easiest state to gain? What's its closest stable state? Right? 8 in that third shell. The easiest way to do that is to gain 1 electron. Right? So they come together. Sodium says, I need to get rid of this guy. Chlorine says, I need 1. Okay, I got what you need. Here you go. Boom. Sodium gives it up. They're stable. Chlorine takes it in. He's stable. And they're happy. Okay? Now, what ends up going with that electron? What happens to the sodium? Loses the electron and then becomes positive. Becomes stable, yes. And also becomes positive because now it has more protons than electrons. And chlorine, on the other hand, has gained an additional electron, so it ends up with a net charge of -1, right? Or a negative net charge. So why do they stay together? Why does sodium and chlorine come together to form salt? Why don't sodium's happy, I don't need you anymore, they leave. Positive and negative, opposite charges, they're attracted to one another. Typically in ionic bonds, the atoms are held together based upon that positive and negative attraction. All right. Now, also other points. A positive charged atom is called a cation, and a negative charged atom is called an anion. So, chlorine gaining an electron becomes an anion, and sodium giving up an electron becomes a cation. Here's what sodium and sodium chloride looks like on your, Cheney tables in Cheney. Okay, it forms a lattice work. Is that based upon that crystal structure, right? Where positive and negative ions are held close to one another based upon their the attraction of charges. What? The lattice work or the? It's just a crystal structure. Questions on ionic or covalent bonds? Now you will definitely study these in more depth and detail in chemistry, but this is where we are at in terms of biology. Other chemical interactions. Hydrogen bonds. Okay, hydrogen bonds is not necessarily a bond, meaning that atoms are going to be intimately stuck together. It's more of an attraction. Okay, positive or negative charged aspects of a compound are sometimes attracted to positively or negative opposite charged parts of other compounds. Okay? So when a hydrogen is covalently bonded to one electronegative atom, it is also attracted to another electronegative atom. You'll see that in a second. All right? In living cells, your electronegative partners are usually oxygen or nitrogen atoms. Like. So here's a hydrogen bond. Hydrogen in water is attached to an electronegative oxygen, right? Forming what? That bond between the hydrogen and oxygen is what? A polar covalent bond. So you have a net positive charge towards the hydrogen. Then you have nitrogen, another electronegative atom. Okay? We have 3 hydrogen bonds forming a net negative charge towards the nitrogen. So in this case, you have a covalently bound hydrogen that is attracted to the negative charge of the nitrogen based upon that slight charge that occurs. So positive on hydrogen of water, negative of nitrogen. They're not bonded together. There's no transfer of electrons. It's just an attraction based upon their charges, their net charges. Okay? This is a relatively weak interaction. Okay? Relatively speaking, in relation to covalent bonds or ionic bonds, which ones, if you put those in order, covalent, ionic, and hydrogen bonds, which ones are the weakest? Of those 3, which are the weakest? Hydrogen bonds. Which are the strongest? Covalent bonds. Why are covalent bonds the strongest interaction? Because they're sharing electrons. Okay? Both atoms depend upon each other's electron in order to fill the outer shells. All right, so they're both sticking together. So we've talked about atomic shape and function, structure. All right, atomic structure and how it relates to function in terms of interacting with other atoms. Now let's look at molecular. And we've already molecular structure. And we've already touched on this in terms of water. Okay? A molecule shape is very important to its function. It's really directly dependent upon shape and function in certain molecules. Okay? Its shape is determined by the interaction of atoms and their valence shells. Okay? In biology, you have recognition and interaction between molecules based upon molecular shape. Right? So you have specificity that occurs. Enzymes are specific for their substrate based upon a shape. Right? A shape recognition. Receptors on cell surface react to certain hormones that are based solely on shape recognition. Okay? This also allows scientists to find molecules that have similar shapes, which then can elicit somewhat similar effects. Right? You'll see it in a second. Endorphins and morphine. Okay? So we have space-filling models for your molecular shape. All right, we have different molecular shape models. You will see all 3 of these throughout. Know that they mean the same. Okay? So here's your natural endorphin. You go out for a run. You come home. You come back to your dorm room, and how do you feel? You're like, oh, I'm tired, but that felt good, right? Oh, yeah, okay. All right, that is based upon a natural endorphin release from the body. Okay. Okay? You are the feeling of pleasure or excitement, invigoration that occurs after exercise, what some people call an exercise high. Okay? That is caused from a natural endorphin release from the body. Endorphins are released, they bind to receptors in the brain cell, in neurons, and then they elicit a certain response. Okay? That's the natural way it goes. Now you have morphine, which is a chemical, right? An endorphin analog that's produced naturally, right? It's an opiate and produced from opium flowers and so on, to then utilized by individuals to relieve pain. Okay? It has a similar structure. Part of its structure is similar to the endorphin, binds to the endorphin receptor based upon a shape recognition on that receptor. All right, and then elicits a similar response in those cells and in the body. So, how are these bonds made? Through reactions. All right? So molecules can interact with one another, atoms will interact with one another, and chemical bonds can be made and they also can be broken. All right? Reactions are the making and breaking of those bonds. The starting molecules are called reactants. What you end up with are products. So here you have simple hydrogen gas plus oxygen gas yields water molecules. This is a synthesis reaction. Right? You're synthesizing water from two reactions. Okay? All chemical reactions are reversible, right? For the most part. They are reversible. Products of the forward reaction can become reactants in the reverse reaction. All right? And chemical equilibrium is reached when the forward and reverse reaction rates are equal. So that you have equal amount of product being produced and product being broken down back into the reactants. Right? They're equally going back and forth. That is chemical equilibrium. Questions on that amount of chemistry? All right. For the next part of this, we're really going to be concerned with chemical makeup of water, okay, and its properties. All right. Water is the biological medium on Earth. It's where life began, okay? And all living organisms require water more than any other substance. So you die within a couple days without having water. You could go a few weeks without having food. Okay. Most cells are surrounded by water, and even the inside of cells are about 80% water as it is. Okay? So, the presence and abundance of water is why there's on Earth. All right? Here's our little polar bear. Poor guy is, I guess he doesn't like water as much as the rest of us because all his habitat is being melted, and then he depends upon that as it is. But water is still. Okay? We know that polar covalent bonds, right, within the water molecule allow it make it a polar molecule, a positive and negative charged end, and that allows part of its properties for hydrogen bonding. All right? So polarity allows water molecules to form hydrogen bonds with one another. So here's our water molecule, oxygen, hydrogen, negative charge, and our net positive charge. Okay, polarity. Now if I was to draw another molecule in here, This would be an oxygen and hydrogens, and oxygen here, hydrogens there. All right. This gives water a certain pure water and the molecules of water an interaction, rules for interacting. All right. They can only do certain things. Okay. Here it is in a space-filling molecule. You have your polar covalent bonds and hydrogen bonds between the hydrogens of those covalent bonds and the oxygens of other molecules. So, 4 emergent properties of water contribute to Earth's suitability for life. All right. So, we've gone from atoms and their structure up to molecules, and we're specifically looking at water molecules. There are 4 emergent properties that occur in water that are not found in the hydrogen or oxygen by themselves. Water is cohesive, okay? Meaning the water molecules are attracted to one another. Oxygen here has a hydrogen bond to the hydrogen of another water molecule, right? So they have an interaction. That hydrogen bonding also contributes to the ability of water to moderate temperature. Okay? Water has a specific heat of 1 calorie. Right? It means it takes 1 calorie of energy to raise 1 milliliter of water 1 degree centigrade. Okay? That raising the temperature of water is only done by breaking these hydrogen bonds. Okay? So less hydrogen bonds, higher temperature. Okay? There's an expansion upon freezing. Okay? As water is cooled, it becomes more dense to a certain point, but as it's frozen, the structure becomes more ordered. Okay? The hydrogen bonds become directed in a complete fashion, in a complete state, in complete structure. That is more, takes up more volume than liquid water. And its polarity also gives it versatility as a solvent, right, to break things down. We're going to go through these 4 things, 4 properties in more detail. So, cohesion. All right. Hydrogen bonds. They hold water molecules together, right, because they are interacted with one another. It's cohesive. So, cohesion refers to water molecule to water molecule. Okay? What role does this play in biology? Example. Where do your tomato plants that your parents might have in the garden at home get their water from? From the ground, from the roots, right? Where are the fruits of that plant produced? On the stems and above ground, right? Okay. How does water move up from the roots to the fruit, eventually out of the leaves? Through the stem. How is it pulled out? How does that actually work? Is there a pumping mechanism inside the plant? No, there's nothing. So how does it do that? Adhesion and cohesion. Okay? So on the underside of plants, there's plant leaves, there are little pores that allow for water to escape. Okay? Molecule by molecule, water is released into the atmosphere. As it's released, it has a hydrogen bond that's with it. And as it's released, it pulls the next one up. Because they are cohesive to one another, each one, there's a net movement of water up the plant and out the leaves, which brings water from the roots with nutrients through the rest of the plant. Okay? Without the cohesiveness of water, plants would have to be grown under a current of water, or like IV fluids of some sort.
Is that capillary action?
It is capillary action. All right? So this also depends upon adhesion. Water not only sticks to itself, but it sticks to other things. Okay? What prevents the water that's in the plant from going back down the stem when you end up not watering the garden for 2 days? That's adhesion. Like water sticks to parts of other things other than water. It sticks to solid material. So someone just said capillary action. You take a tube, a straw, you put it in a little amount of water, and upon capillary action, it will actually move up the straw, or glass straw, up till it's filled based upon capillary action. All right? The water molecules are adhering to this glass tube and filling the straw, or filling the tube. Okay? Example between water and plant cell walls. All right? Cohesion also gives the property of surface tension. Okay? What is surface tension?
There's so much hydrogen bonding that they're so close that there's almost not solid surface, but it's like enough surface that like bugs can like walk.
So it allows things to stay on top of the water surface. Okay? Things that are light enough to not break those hydrogen bonds, that they'll stay on top of the surface itself. Okay? It's a measurement. Surface tension is a measurement of how hard it takes to break the surface of a liquid. Okay? Because of the cohesiveness of water molecules, water has a higher surface tension than, say, water with detergent in it. Okay? Which would disrupt those hydrogen bonds. All right? So that's all right. So here's your plant's direction of water. It's because you have adhesion and cohesion going on at once. The water molecules adhere to the sides of the cell wall, and they're also pulled up and out of the tree. And then, example of surface tension. This spider is not heavy enough, not enough force to break the cohesiveness of water molecules on the surface, so it can actually stay on the surface of the water without sinking through. Questions on cohesion or adhesion? Surface tension. All right, we'll stop there.